I'm a big fan of mystery stories, and one of the most famous mystery stories is The Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe. The basic storyline, and I hope I'm not spoiling this for anybody, is that someone needs to hide a very valuable letter, but they need to keep it nearby, even knowing that their apartment is going to be comprehensively searched. So much of the story describes the comprehensive search for this letter, and how they did all these things like probe the cushions of the furniture with long pins and look at the joints of the wooden furniture through microscopes to see if there was any sawdust from something being hollowed out, and all these very clever searching techniques. And of course the police utterly fail to find the letter, and they have to call in the clever detective. And the clever detective looks around the room and thinks about it for a bit, and notices that there's a letter rack sitting right in the middle of the room. The incredibly valuable purloined letter was rubbed with some dirt and halfway torn through in the middle and sitting in plain sight. It was obvious if you knew where it was, but otherwise it was hidden in plain sight. One of the most powerful concepts in all of economics is also completely obvious when you look for it, but otherwise it's hidden in plain sight. And that concept is called the division of labor. Now, what is the division of labor? The division of labor is when we divide the production of a certain good or service into related groups of smaller tasks, with each worker focusing on a limited part of the overall process. Adam Smith, who I've mentioned before, is the fellow who founded the systematic study of economics, devotes the very first chapter of his first book in The Wealth of Nations to the idea of the division of labor. He actually went to visit a real factory, a pin factory. And he noticed that at that factory, each individual worker did not make a pin from beginning to end. Instead, the job of making a pin was divided up into a bunch of separate tasks. Let me quote Smith. He said, "One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper. And the important business of making a pin is, in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some manufactories are all performed by distinct hands, though in others the same man will sometimes perform 2 or 3 of them." Smith estimated that if there was one person who had to make pins from beginning to end with each of those 18 different steps, that individual person might be able to make about 20 pins in a day. But if you had a small pin factory with only OK machinery circa 1776, and you had a group of workers making the pins, then on average, each worker could make the equivalent of 4,800 pins in a day. Breaking up the task into many small parts and focusing on how to do each of those parts is an extraordinarily powerful way of increasing production. And that's what the division of labor is all about. More modern, but still homely example was an essay by an economist called Leonard Read, a classic essay that was written in 1958. It's called I, Pencil. And Leonard Read wrote an essay in which the pencil tells the story of how all of its parts were produced through division of labor in the economy. And he sort of says, imagine what it takes to make a pencil. Well, there's wood from cedar forests of Northern California. And of course that has to be logged and shipped by train and milled and eventually made into wood for the pencil. The lead in the pencil is actually a mix of graphite from Ceylon and clay from Mississippi. Someone has to know how to put all that together. There's yellow paint on the outside of the pencil. That's made from castor beans. The brass at the top of the pencil that holds the eraser on is a mix of zinc and copper and nickel. The eraser is a mixture of some special vegetable oil from the Dutch East Indies, along with pumice from Italy and various chemicals that bind the whole thing together. If you think about it, it may literally be true that there is no single person in the world today who has the set of skills needed to make a pencil from scratch. Now, I always say that and I always think, well, there's probably someone sitting in a laboratory at MIT who actually knows all about wood and metal and chemicals and plastics and could literally do it. But, you know, it's not a very large group. And yet, a pencil is such a cheap thing. You know, you drop one on the floor, you let it roll away, you don't even think twice about it. But it's an almost miraculous composition of many, many different substances. And if you think about the stuff you buy in stores, the stuff that's available to you, almost everything in the economy is a result of a division of labor much like that, with many, many different parts and pieces for the goods, the packaging, the labeling, the transportation, and all the rest. And an economy somehow manages to coordinate that job. It can coordinate a product as complicated as a pencil. It's a miraculous thing if you think about it. The division of labor creates substantial economic gains, both at the level of the firm that's producing a good and also at the level of a national economy. Let's think first of all about why it would increase output at the level of a firm. And there are basically three reasons why that would happen. One reason is that when workers look at a particular task and they can specialize in a particular task, that will allow workers with different characteristics and different skills to focus on the production where they have an advantage. So you can think about the different kinds of advantages different people might have. Sometimes they might result from geography. I mean, it's a lot easier to be a wheat farmer in Kansas and an orange grower in Florida just because of where you live. In other cases, the advantage might arise from decisions about education. People with medical degrees tend to make better doctors than people who don't have medical degrees. Advantages might be related to whether you're near a lot of population nearby, and can you sell to a bunch of people there, or are you near transportation or communications? If you're in a big city, it's a lot easier to operate a successful dry cleaner than if you're off in an isolated rural area somehow. So, one big way in which the division of labor helps is it lets people focus on the things they tend to be best suited to do. And that has to do with both who the people are and what their mix of skills is, and also sort of where they're located in the world and what their geography is. A second reason why the division of labor can increase output. Workers who specialize in something typically become more productive as they learn about what it is. And they become more productive with practice, and they're better at coming up with new ideas. Now, this pattern holds for many, many different jobs. If you think about assembly line workers building a car, often the person who's best at coming up with a new way of doing that particular task on the assembly line is the worker who faces that job every single day. People cutting hair get much more efficient at it when they do it day after day. Lawyers writing wills, doctors performing heart surgery. Those specialized workers are all people who know the job so well that they're the ones who can think about ways to do it faster and better. It's not just at the individual level of the worker. There's even an argument that for firms as a whole, for organizations as a whole, organizations develop a kind of competence. The lingo that they use the last 15 years or so is they say that firms have a core competency. And what they sort of mean is that firms are particularly good at a certain set of tasks, a limited set of tasks, and that a firm which focuses on its core competencies will tend to do better than a firm which tries to do everything all at once. A third reason why a division of labor helps to increase output is that it adds to specialization, which allows someone to take advantage of economies of scale. Now, economies of scale is one of these jargon terms we need to define a little bit. Economies of scale means when a larger firm can produce at a lower average cost of production than a smaller firm, at least up to some level of output. Now, mentally, when I think about this, you can sort of think about, imagine a factory that's producing cars, and it produces only 100 cars a year. Well, if it did that, it's going to be very expensive to make each car. That's almost like making the cars one at a time, making one car every 2 or 3 days. But if the factory produces 10,000 cars a year or 50,000 cars a year, then it can set up an assembly line with, huge machines and workers performing very specialized tasks. And the average cost of production per car is going to be much lower for the big factory than it would be for the very small factory. Now, economies of scale are really important for thinking about how the world works. If there weren't any economies of scale, then, hey, you might as well make your own car, right? Because it's just as easy for you to make one car as it is for the factory to make 10,000. Or you can kind of imagine that every little city and town would have a million tiny little factories for making, cars and refrigerators and clothing and all the other products that are out there. Of course, that's not what actually happens. In a world that has economies of scale, cities and towns each have a few larger production plants that can take advantage of those economies of scale. And that way they divide up the labor, and then the factories and plants that produce one kind of thing in one area, one city, one region, then can trade with other cities and other regions. And so this division of labor doesn't just happen within the firm in terms of individuals doing certain tasks, it also happens for the economy as a whole, in terms of how the tasks of producing different products are divided up across an economy. A high-income economy has a greater division of labor, a more specialized division of labor than a low-income economy. Because of specialization in trade, you don't need to know anything about, say, electronics or sound systems. You just go down to some electronics retailer and you buy a CD player and you play a CD. You don't have to know how it works. You don't have to know anything about how artificial fiber is made or the construction of sewing machines. You just buy a jacket and wear it. You don't need to know anything about internal combustion engines. You just buy a car and drive it. A remarkable thing in a high-income economy is that you don't have to learn most of what's involved. You don't have to know the knowledge or the skills that all the different people have. Instead, you can just buy goods which embody all of that different knowledge, and then you can pay for those goods by working at a highly specialized job of your own. And the way to think about that is that the economy, in a way, is the social mechanism that coordinates this extraordinary division of labor. A fine economist named Robert Heilbroner, who died in 2005, once wrote, the overwhelming majority of Americans have never grown food, caught game, raised meat, ground grain into flour, or even fashioned flour into bread. Faced with the challenge of clothing themselves or building their own homes, they would be hopelessly untrained and unprepared. Even to make minor repairs in the machines that surround them, they must call on other members of the community whose job it is to fix cars or repair plumbing or whatever. Paradoxically, perhaps, Heilbroner continues, the richer the nation, the more apparent is the inability of its average inhabitants to survive unaided and alone. I think about how specialized my job is as someone who edits an academic economics journal and teaches economics classes. Many of you have jobs within an organization that provide some overall good or service, but you provide only a tiny slice of the overall product of what that organization provides. Even if you run your own business, you rely on outside suppliers for all sorts of tools and communications and delivery and for facilitating the stream of payments for when you're buying things or selling things. One vivid illustration of the division of labor happens, I think, if you're in a little town or in a big city, next time this happens, look at the phone book and look back in the yellow pages and just look at the categories in the yellow pages. You expect, of course, that in the big city the phone book will be fatter. But what's unexpected, unless you think about the division of labor, is that the big city is going to have categories of things that don't even exist in the small town. For example, the big city might have a whole bunch of shops devoted to necktie restoration or supplies for professional magic shows. And that'll be a category in the yellow pages. Not just one store, but a group of stores that do that. How does that work? How can you have a store like that? Well, in a big city, the division of labor can be so much greater because there's so many people in the immediate local area that it can support a store like that. In a rural area, you can't support a highly specialized store. There's not enough people there to provide the demand for that division of labor. In fact, it's true that once you adjust for education and experience, People who live in a city, in a big metropolitan area, get paid more on average than people who live in rural areas. Again, after adjusting for education and work experience. And a lot of that is probably due, in fact, that cities have a greater division of labor. People can specialize more, and as they specialize more, they can take advantage of the greater production that they can get. The basic argument about how the division of labor increases production within a local economy or within a firm can apply just as well to how it can increase production in the global economy as well. Just like the argument within a firm is let workers do what they're best suited to do, well, at the national level, the idea would be, well, let's let nations focus on what they're best suited to do. Just as we talk about workers developing specialized skills and expertise, let nations develop specialized skills and expertise. And just as within, say, the US economy, we let producers in a small town somewhere have a factory that makes, say, air conditioners that they sell all over the country, within the global economy, you can imagine that producers in small countries would be able to have a factory that would make goods they would sell all over the world economy. So precisely the same arguments that apply to increasing output because of the division of labor among individual firms and within an economy apply to the global economy just as well. In fact, one of the big trends in world trade in the last decade or so is sometimes called breaking up the value chain. And what they mean by that is that the parts of production are becoming more widely separated. It used to be, for example, that you could say, well, this car is made in the US and this car is made in Japan. But now what might happen is, the plastic cover for the seat is made in one place. The springs are made in another place. They're stitched together in another place. It's installed in the car in another place, going back and forth across national borders. And at the end of the day, when you say, where was the car made, it's not obvious where it was made. It was made in a variety of different countries, and the value chain was all divided up. So when we think about this link from how the division of labor happens between people, we need to think about, for the global economy, that we don't want to focus on making everything ourselves. For the same reason that you shouldn't try to make everything yourself in your own life, it makes a lot more sense in the global economy for everyone to produce everything. Because the division of labor, if everyone specializes and produces individual stuff, will make everyone vastly better off than if they tried to do it on their own. Now, there are many issues involved in international trade, and we'll devote several lectures later in this course to those issues. I don't mean to resolve all of international trade right here. But what I do mean to say right here is that there's a reason why international trade benefits different countries. And that reason is fundamentally the same reason, the division of labor, as why splitting up tasks in an economy benefit all people. Now, the division of labor inevitably leads to a situation where people specialize and they trade with others with what they want to consume. I want to try and offer you sort of a metaphor of how the economy works from this perspective. And I call it the storehouse metaphor for the economy. Storehouse metaphor for the economy works something like this. Imagine that all the production of the economy could be collected in one storehouse. When you produce something, whatever it is, you bring it around to the entrance door and you drop it in the storehouse. Whenever you consume something, you go around to the back door and you take out whatever it is you want. Now, of course, the division of labor means we're all producing different things and bringing them to the storehouse. But here's the problem the storehouse faces. The stuff that goes in the storehouse needs to be the same as what comes out of the storehouse. In a macroeconomic sense, looking at the economy as a whole, you need to have some linkage between what people bring to the storehouse and what they take out. And in a product-by-product sense, if a bunch of people bring wheat or bread or whatever into the storehouse, that needs to be what's taken out of the storehouse too. It would be pointless, of course, to have some things just piling up in the storehouse that no one ever used, that had no particular function. And it would be nice to avoid a situation where lots and lots of people are standing at the back door waiting for something that just isn't available at the storehouse. So how can we make this happen? How can we coordinate what goes in and what comes out? Well, the honor system is not a practical answer here. We can't just sort of say, well, bring whatever you like, take out whatever you like. We think this will all work out well. I sometimes think of this as the dormitory refrigerator problem when I talk about it with students. If you've got a common shared refrigerator in your dormitory, and you kind of hope that everyone will just put stuff in the refrigerator and everyone will just take stuff out of the refrigerator when they need it, everyone's going to be really peeved at each other in a very, very short time. Doesn't work well in a dormitory. It wouldn't work well if people could walk into grocery stores and mega malls and just take whatever they think they need. On the production side, in terms of bringing stuff into the storehouse, just sort of hoping that everyone will work as hard as they can and as smart as they can and bring everything to the storehouse and deposit it out of some sense of duty to the human race, that just is not very likely either. So I guess I'm trying to make the point that you just can't count on the honor system to work here. The great economist Karl Marx, and he was a truly great economist, even if some of his economic theories haven't stood the test of time especially well, once said, "From each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs." And one way of thinking about my point here is that your needs are not a given, at least not above some basic level of sustenance. There's an element of choice involved. There's an element of reacting to incentives. And your abilities are not a given either. People in one setting might barely work at all, and people in another setting suddenly exert extraordinary effort to get something done. So when we think about from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, we actually need to think about, well, if people are developing their abilities, what investment are they going to make in their education and their job skills? What incentives do they have to do that? How hard are they going to work? And we need to think about what mechanisms we're providing in our society to encourage the abilities and the needs somehow to match up. All of this is a long, long-winded way of saying society needs to reach some decision that will value about what people bring to the storehouse and how to value what people take out of the storehouse and have some link between the two. If somebody brings something to the storehouse that absolutely nobody wants, like whistles that you have personally carved out of wooden clothing pins, if no one wants them, they don't have any value. And if someone brings something to the storehouse where there's already a lot of it there, then it shouldn't have that much value either. Like, in the summertime, if everyone brings more zucchini to the storehouse, that extra zucchini just shouldn't have a real high value. Conversely, if someone brings something to the storehouse that people are really eager to have and that lots of people really want, it should somehow be given a higher value. And if someone brings something to the storehouse there's hardly any of, and people would like to have it like, say, diamonds, then that should have a higher value as well. Now, when you're taking stuff out of the storehouse, you need to think about these same kinds of issues, where the value is somehow related to what people want and what is in the storehouse already. If you want something where lots and lots of it is easily available, well, you can have it. That it can have a low value. But if you want something where there's hardly any of it and lots of other people want it, then you need to treat it as something with a pretty high value. Now, if you've had some economics before, you can almost feel the terminology. It's quivering on the tip of your tongue. The values and the prices of what goes in and out of the storehouse are determined by supply and demand. They're determined by what there is that's being provided and what there is people want. What you bring to the storehouse in a market economy is measured by its price in the market. And what you take out is measured by its price. The money that you earn is a price for your labor. What you pay for goods is the price of those goods. The price mechanism and those forces of supply and demand are how a market economy coordinates this whole business of the division of labor and tries to match up what goes into the great storehouse of the economy and what comes out the other end. Now, I'm fully aware that this is a fairly limited analogy in some ways. I mean, clearly, I'm leaving out lots of issues. I'm leaving out issues about how business firms operate. I'm leaving about issues about, advertisements and whether they're profits and non-profit firms. I'm leaving about the role of government. I'm leaving out taxes and regulation and spending. This is a metaphor. I'm pitching this at a fairly high level. I promise you we'll get into those sorts of issues as we go along. But at some fundamental level, getting past those kinds of institutional details. I'm trying to make the point that an economy and the markets in an economy are a method of coordinating all of the production and consumption that happens because of the division of labor. It's a way of providing a set of incentives for people to bring stuff to that great storehouse of the economy. And it's a way of setting some limits on what people can take out of the economy and providing some incentives for people to make careful choices about what they take and not just sort of take everything like the economy is some giant buffet line where everyone can load up their plate as much as they want to. Now, in theory, of course, the decisions about what is brought in and what's taken out could be made by the government. They could be made by individuals. But no matter what, society is going to have to answer those three basic questions. What is made, how is it made, and who's going to consume it? And a market is one way of trying to coordinate that entire process. A decentralized economy with its division of labor works so marvelously well at meeting social needs that for practical purposes, people often just assume that it was going to work and they completely ignore it. One of my favorite examples of thinking about this, how people ignore the economy and the division of labor, is from a 19th century French writer named Frédéric Bastiat. Bastiat was not much of an economist, but he was a highly skilled polemicist and wrote a lot of descriptions of how the economy works that teachers of economics still like to quote today. This is Bastiat's description of the city of Paris being fed and looking out over the city of Paris and thinking about whether there would be food for this city tomorrow. It's a bit of an extended quotation, but again, I'm fond of it. So Bastiat says, "On entering Paris, which I had come to visit, I said to myself, here are 1 million of human beings who would all die in a short time if provisions of every kind ceased to flow toward this metropolis. Imagination is baffled when it tries to appreciate the vast multiplicity of commodities which must enter tomorrow through the barriers in order to preserve the inhabitants from falling prey to the convulsions of famine, rebellion, and pillage. And yet, all sleep at this moment, and their peaceful slumbers are not disturbed for a single instant by the prospect of such a frightful catastrophe." Bastiat continues, "How does each succeeding day bring what is wanted, nothing more, nothing less, to so gigantic a market? What then is the ingenious and secret power which governs the astonishing regularity of movements so complicated? A regularity in which everybody has implicit faith, although happiness and life itself are at stake. That power is an absolute principle, the principle of freedom in transactions. We must have faith," Bastiat said, "in that inward light which Providence has placed in the hearts of all men, and to which he has confided the preservation and indefinite amelioration of our species, a regard to personal interest, since we must give it its right name, a principle so active, so vigilant, so foreseeing when it is free in its action. In what situation, I would ask, would the inhabitants of Paris be if a minister should take it into his head to substitute for this power the combinations of his own genius, however superior we might suppose them to be? If he thought to subject to his supreme direction this prodigious mechanism, to hold the springs of it in his hands, to decide by whom, or in what manner, or on what conditions, everything needed should be produced, transported, exchanged, and consumed. Truly, there may be much suffering within the walls of Paris, poverty, despair, perhaps starvation, causing more tears to flow than ardent charity is able to dry up. But I affirm that it is probable, nay, it is certain, that the arbitrary intervention of government would multiply infinitely those sufferings and spread over all our fellow citizens those evils which at present affect only a small number of them." It's the end of the quotation. But just think about it for a moment. You must have heard some of these stories from time to time about people who come to the United States from some low-income country or some country where the government controlled everything, a socialist economy, and they just walk down the aisles of a giant grocery store or they just walk through a giant shopping mall and they are just thunderstruck at what they see. They can't believe what's on the shelves. When you go to sleep at night, do you ever worry whether the stores will have food tomorrow? Do you ever worry whether there will be any gasoline available or will be completely gone? I don't mean can you pay for it or not. I mean, do you worry whether it will be there at all? Or do you sleep soundly at night, not at all worried about the problem that if a whole lot of things don't happen, there won't be any food in your city tomorrow? If you don't worry, you've just paid the free market an extraordinary compliment. One major part of economics is to understand and analyze and maybe marvel just a bit at what the economy accomplishes every day.